So the brainstem is the inferiormost portion of the brain that consists of three main regions. We have our midbrain, our pons, and our medulla oblongata. Now, it's similar in structure to the spinal cord because it has gray matter that's deeper and white matter that's more superficial. However, the gray matter of your brainstem is embedded in what we call nuclei, which are little centers of collections of cell bodies of neurons. Now, we think of the brainstem as being like the vital center, so it controls these automatic behaviors that are necessary for survival and homeostasis. It also contains fiber tracts that connect higher and lower neural centers, and nuclei that are associated with 10 of the 12 cranial nerves. So your midbrain is the superiormost portion of the brainstem, and it's located just between the diencephalon and the pons, so it's kind of sandwiched there between those two regions. Now, the superiormost portion of the midbrain contains your cerebral peduncles, which are these ventral or anterior bulges that contain the pyramidal motor tracts. If y'all remember, the primary motor cortex had pyramidal cells with axons that extended downward towards the brainstem and spinal cord because they contained information in axons that's for conscious motor movement. And it forms these pillars that kind of hold up the cerebrum. In fact, peduncle kind of means little foot. Now, the cerebral aqueduct is right in the middle of the midbrain. It's a channel that runs through it, and it connects the third and fourth ventricles. There's some gray matter around this cerebral aqueduct we call periaqueductal gray. And this contains nuclei that play a role in pain suppression as well as the fight or flight response. So if we looked at a view of your brainstem here, you'd see that in purple is actually the diencephalon, and then in green is the brainstem. So it has our midbrain, our pons, and medulla oblongata. You can zoom in on that. See midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. And remember, the midbrain contains your cerebral peduncles, which is what we can see here. That contains your pyramidal motor tracts. And in the middle, we would actually have our central canal, as well as in the posterior side, these bumps back here form what's called Corpora quadrigemina, and that's part of the tectum. Now, the tectum, which is the Corpora quadrigemina, that's involved with visual and auditory reflex. In fact, these two superior bumps are the superior colliculi. These are involved with visual reflex. And then these two inferior bumps down here, the inferior colliculi, these are involved with auditory reflex. So the Corpora quadrigemina are those four bumps we saw. Superior colliculi are the visual reflex centers, the two superior bumps. Inferior colliculi are the auditory reflex centers. And when I say reflex, I'm saying that's under unconscious control. So a visual reflex would be like, a ball flying at your face and you squint really quickly, right? Or the auditory reflex would be like you hear a loud clap and then you kind of flinch rapidly. That's an inferior colliculus structure. Now, Substantia nigra is also a function or structure of the midbrain, and it's functionally linked to the basal nuclei. So it's also involved with movement. In fact, Substantia nigra is really affected in Parkinson's disease because you get degeneration of this type of tissue. The midbrain also contains a red nucleus, which is actually a relay center for some descending limb flexion motor pathways. So if we looked at a cross-section of the midbrain here, we would find the ventral surface contains your cerebral peduncles, which have your fiber tracts for pyramidal motor neurons. We have our substantia nigra, which is functionally linked with the basal nuclei for movement. The red nucleus, which is also involved with movement, as well as oculomotor nuclei that are involved with moving, oculomotor nerve. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. And in the very posterior side, we find our superior and inferior colliculi, which are functionally part of the tectum or the corpora quadrigemina. And so right in the middle of the midbrain, you can see our cerebral aqueduct, which is the part of the ventricular system that will connect the third and fourth ventricles. And the gray matter that surrounds it is the periaqueductal gray, which is involved with things like your fight or flight response, as well as pain modulation or suppression. So the pons is located just inferior to the midbrain, so it's the middle of the brainstem. And your pons is located just between the midbrain and medulla oblongata. The fourth ventricle separates the pons from your cerebellum. And what you find the pons are lots of tracts. So you have longitudinal fibers that connect higher brain centers and your spinal cord. You find transverse fibers that relay impulses between the motor cortex and cerebellum. And there are some nuclei in the pons that are involved with the reticular formation, which is for arousal and awareness, as well as nuclei that are involved with maintaining normal breathing rhythm. So when you think about like the rate and the depth and the smoothness of breathing, that's involved with nuclei that are found within your pons. So if you took a cross-section to the pons, you'd see that there's lots of nuclei here that are associated with cranial nerves, like your trigeminal nerve nuclei are here. We also find some of the fiber tracts from your pyramidal motor neurons here as well. Nuclei that are involved with reticular formation, which is involved with awareness and arousal, as well as parts of the peduncles that are involved with connecting to the cerebellum for communication of information. And pontine nuclei that are located here on the anterior surface of the pons are involved with generating respiratory rhythm, as well as modulating the smoothness of that respiratory rhythm. So when you think about the pons, it's an important relay center. The reticular formation here is involved with arousal, but it also contains centers that are involved with respiratory rhythm, like breathing rhythm. So the medulla oblongata is the inferior most portion of your brainstem, also known just as the medulla. In fact, medulla means marrow. Oblongata just means oblong. So it actually is the inferior most portion of your brain that kind of blends with the spinal cord at the level of the foramen magnum, which is that large hole in the base of your skull. Now, the medulla oblongata also contains portions of your fourth ventricle, and it's a continuation of the central canal of the spinal cord. Now, the medulla and pons form the ventral wall. And you also find choroid plexus in the fourth ventricle. It's involved with making CSF. Now, if you took a cross-section through the medulla oblongata, you'd find that it contains a lot of different nuclei here. We got the solitary nuclei, we have the inferior cerebellar peduncles, we have the reticular formation nuclei here as well as the pyramids and the olives that are found on the anterior surface of your medulla oblongata. You see on the posterior side we find portions of the fourth ventricle and choroid plexus, which make CSF. And when you think about like the functions and structures of your medulla oblongata, we have our pyramids, which are these ventral longitudinal ridges that are formed by the pyramidal motor tracts from your motor cortex. This is also where these things cross. So if you remember going back to the cortex, we talked about how there was contralateral control of function, where the opposite side of your brain controls that opposite side of your body. So for instance, if you're going to control the muscles of your left arm, you're actually going to be using the right side of your brain. Now, where those axons cross to the opposite side is here at the level of the pyramids. So decussation is the crossing point. This is the place where the pyramidal motor tracts cross from right to left or left to right. This is why we actually have contralateral control over our body parts. So the olives are the kind of lateral swellings that are caused by inferior olivary nuclei. Now these are involved with relaying stretch information from muscles and joints to the cerebellum. That way your cerebellum gets a little bit of proprioceptive or body sensation feedback about your current body position. Now we also find vestibular and cochlear nuclei that help mediate responses to maintain equilibrium. So when you're maintaining your own body balance, this is involved with nuclei here in the medulla oblongata. It also contains the nucleus cuneatus and nucleus crucilis, which relay ascending sensory information from your spinal cord. Now other functions of the medulla oblongata, and this is kind of like the key functions here, is the medulla is really an autonomic reflex center. Now it has a lot of the same functions of the hypothalamus, so there's some redundancy here, or overlap. But some of the functional groups of your medulla oblongata include the cardiovascular center, and of this we have our cardiac center and our vasomotor center. The cardiac center adjusts the force and the rate of heart muscle contraction. The vasomotor center adjusts blood vessel diameter to regulate blood pressure. So when you think about how important your medulla oblongata is for homeostasis, it controls your heart rate and rhythm as well as your blood pressure. Now, it also contains respiratory centers that can help regulate respiratory rhythm and the depth of breathing, kind of like the pons does, as well as other reflex centers for vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. So you think about how vital the medulla oblongata is to your survival. You essentially need this to maintain your blood pressure, your respiratory rhythm, and your heart's rhythm.